Today, I want to share with you a few thoughts about life to the full and really invite you into the question, are you surviving or are you thriving? We all want to thrive. I don't think anybody wants to just survive and get by. I meet people everywhere who feel like they are kind of just surviving. And so I want to share with you just a few thoughts from some great thinkers and some life experience about how we might move a little further on that spectrum, right? A little further away from just surviving into thriving. There's a great philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre. He said, everything has been figured out except how to live. We live in this era of so much technological growth and advancement, and we have learned how to deal with so many questions. And yet how to live is one of the most important. People are more anxious than ever. And it feels like we're just getting by and not really thriving. I think there might be three very serious obstacles that any one of us could face to how we can live fully. The first is suffering, the second is fatigue, and the third is boredom. Now, I want to start with suffering. Viktor Frankl faced suffering in a pretty intense way because he actually is a survivor of the concentration camp. He concluded that it was not suffering itself, but the lack of meaning that led people to despair, that led people to feel like they just couldn't go on. And he noted that even while he was in the midst of the concentration camps, the most profound suffering, that the key to survival was not so much in physical strength. It was not those who were the hardiest, the strongest, but it was in spiritual freedom that people found the means to not only survive, but even thrive in the places of the deepest suffering. How do we find this spiritual freedom? Frankl reflected that even in the midst of the camps, they could find deep meaning in the smallest signs of beauty, truth, and goodness. He said sometimes, even in prison, they could get a small glimpse of the sunset or a starry sky. He said that sometimes he saw human compassion even in a guard that would let him rest for even just a moment without beating him. He said that sometimes in the camp, you could hear in the far-off distance the sound of someone playing music instead of the endless shouting. And even those small symbols of beauty became reminders of his humanity and the fact that every human person has dignity. He said that even in the camps, people found that if they had a sense of humor about life, they could do more than just survive, but they could at least survive. So the prisoners would formulate jokes and comedy skits. And Frankl said that this attempt to develop a sense of humor and to see things in a humorous light, he said is some kind of trick learned while mastering the art of living. That sometimes we have to learn, even in the midst of suffering, to know when to laugh, to know when to seek that funny moment, that funny lightness of life. But by far among the experiences that helped Frankl survive and maybe even thrive, even in a camp, was the memory of his wife and the love that they had shared. He wrote this in Man's Search for Meaning. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of man is through love and in love. If we're really going to survive and thrive, we have to experience love. And I'll say more about that later in this talk. Frankl assessed that when we're facing suffering, especially long-term and extreme suffering, humans tend to go through three different stages in regard to that suffering. He said the first of the stages is horror. In our humanity, there's this instinctive repugnance to suffering, whether that's our own suffering or someone else's. Like, we're horrified by that. We know life isn't supposed to be full of suffering. We weren't made to suffer. A second stage is apathy. We feel like there's nothing we can do to get out of the suffering or to stop someone else's suffering. And he says it's not that people don't care, but it's a form of self-defense. It's like, I feel like I can't do anything about this suffering, so I just give up. And he said that leads into the third stage, which is a loss of value, where you start to even think, do I have any meaning? Does life have any meaning? Does anything have meaning? We are exposed to more than just the average amount of suffering through the media. We're exposed to huge amounts of suffering. And I think we have to be really careful about how much we feed that into our souls, right? Because if you're always confronted with suffering and you feel like there's nothing you can do about it, that kind of leads to this horror, apathy, loss of value. And yet we have some control over that. We have some control of how much media we take in. I was working in a high school setting, and there was a young woman who was unusually bright. She literally lit up the room. I don't mean bright academically, even though she was that, but bright in the sense of she brought hope. I couldn't really fathom why she was so different. And towards the end of the academic year, I invited her to give a speech to her peers at a retreat day we were having, a day where we were just going to enter into some reflection and prayer. When she started her speech, she began it with this long, complicated list of scientific terms that I didn't even know what they were at first. She said, "These are the names of the medications I take every day in order to be standing in front of you right now." I didn't know, even though I had taught this young woman all year, that she was very sick, that she had an illness that was not going away and that required significant treatments every day of her life. And that from the time she was a very young child, the doctors had said she wouldn't survive more than a few years. And her family had taken her many places to try to find healing. And interestingly, she never received physical healing. She battled the illness and she still battles it. But she has far outlived every prognosis given. What her parents said to me when I asked them about the illness, they said, "Sister, we prayed, we hoped, we did everything we could medically, spiritually for her healing. And what happened is not that her body got better. What happened is that she came to see every single day, every single moment as a gift. Her suffering actually made her a person more alive, a person who recognized what's true for all of us, but that many of us don't think about, is that every moment is gift. Every day is a new opportunity. And so suffering can awaken us if we allow it into a space of hope. Maybe one of the more subtle obstacles to living fully, though, is the second, fatigue. Archbishop Fulton Sheen addresses the concept of mental fatigue, and he said that there were two root causes to mental fatigue. He identifies the first as having no goal in life, no direction, or the second, having too many goals. If you have no philosophy of life, no guiding principle, it can lead you to a real fatigue. Fulton Sheen said this: "We would not keep a new gadget in the house for 10 minutes without discovering its purpose. And yet we will live with ourselves for 10, 30, 60 years and not know why we're here or where we're going." If we don't have a sense of purpose in life, why I'm here, what my life's about, then we lose the energy to pursue our goals. Now, a counterexample of this is someone who's about to be canonized a saint in the Catholic Church, a young man from Italy named Pier Giorgio Frassati. Pier Giorgio lived really fully. He said, "To live without faith, without a patrimony to defend, without a steady struggle for truth, that is not living, but existing." And Pier Giorgio Frassati lived fully. He had many friends. He had a vibrant prayer life. He loved mountain climbing. He loved the outdoors. And he always went beyond himself to give to others. But he had a central focus on living his life to the full because he lived for Christ. And he found ways to live to serve Christ in serving others, especially in serving the poor. On the other hand, Fulton Sheen says we can have too many goals in life. That if we're the kind who are looking all around us and saying, every time we are introduced to a new concept, a new way of being, we shift what life is about, then we get kind of burnt out from that. Fulton Sheen wrote this. He said, "If you give students a target in life, a real goal, and let them exercise that freedom toward their goal, they will not suffer from the boredom of life. When I see in my students a passion, a direction, something they're aiming for, they're on fire, they have the energy to do what they need to do. If we have too many goals, if every time we read something new, watch something new, every new ideology that comes along, we shift our perspective on living, that can burn us out too. It's not by keeping all options indefinitely open that we find meaning in life. It's a real myth that we can have all things at all times. It's a deep error about living, that if I just keep all my options open and never commit to anything, that's going to keep me the most free. Freedom was made to be engaged towards something worth living for. Fulton Sheen says, firstly, have a master idea. Life is not really something random and meaningless. It's not something that's just predetermined by our genetics or by our environment. We have real freedom. and we're called into relationship. So we have to have a kind of sense of, what do I live for? What does life mean? And that's going to guide where we're going to use our energies. Secondly, he says, you need to strengthen your will. Once you know where you want to head in life, what's important to you, you need to actually exercise your freedom towards that. You need to act. And God gives us grace to act towards a bigger goal. Okay. But we also have to be engaged. One of the great saints in the Catholic Church is St. Thomas Aquinas. And one day his sister said to him, how do I live well? How do I become a saint? How do I become fully everything I was meant to be? And he said, will it. Now, he was not ignoring the fact that you need God's strength to do that, God's grace. But he was like, you have to make choices. Whatever is your goal, you move towards it by the way you make your choices. And thirdly, Fulton Sheen said, you need to have recourse to outside power. You have to admit that you are not just an isolated person in this world, that you belong to a community, that you depend on others. You have to take the risk of relationships. If the problem is not suffering or fatigue, it can also be boredom. The great philosopher Peter Kreeft says, modern man's deepest fear is boredom. I mean, why do we scroll endlessly on different forms of social media? Because we get bored. We don't know what to do with our lives. Peter Kreeft says that there's actually something positive about boredom. He says, we are spoiled by the knowledge of the best and therefore cannot be satisfied with anything less. What does he mean by that? You actually weren't made for just surviving, just getting by figuring out what you're going to eat today, figuring out how you're going to waste a bunch of time. You actually were made for relationship. You were actually made for something better. In history, there was a very famous man who was bored. His name was Augustine. He lived in North Africa in the 4th century. He got bored because he pursued everything this world could bring, right? He would study all different things, but he was kind of too smart for most of the things that he was studying. And he saw all the holes in the philosophies of life he was learning, but they just didn't satisfy him. So he kind of pursued pleasure, just enjoy life. But Augustine always felt somehow there was something missing. He was bored with life. But eventually, he met someone who could answer the questions he had. This man's name was Ambrose. Ambrose, who was the bishop of the city of Milan, led him into a way of looking at the world that was different. And eventually, Augustine was bowled over by a God he had not known, or maybe had kind of known but rejected when he was on a different path. And he wrote a famous line that's repeated again and again, but it's so worth thinking about. He was talking about God, and he said, "You have made us for yourselves, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." And because of the God-shaped void that is in our being, we can only live fully when we live as God lives, because we were made by God in the image of God. And God is love. And that means that we're only going to live as fully as we love. The Greek tradition had 4 different ways of talking about love: the love of affection, the love of friendship, the love of desire and romance, and the love called agape, that was self-gift to another. Now, this love we long for is not just any love. It's not just emotional, feel-good. It's not just kind of a casual relationship. It's a love that has no limit and that never ends. And that's why even when Augustine was pursuing all these relationships that weren't really stable, he still felt that boredom with life. But why is agape the love that never ends? Because it's the love that God pours out eternally. The love that called us into being. Like, we came into being through love. And that even when we were lost in the darkness, came for us. One of the most quoted lines in the Bible: "For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that everyone who believes in him might not perish, but might have eternal life." If we want to live life to the full, we have to let ourselves be loved to the full. The great scientist Albert Einstein said, "There are only 2 ways to live your life. One is though nothing is a miracle. The other is as though everything is a miracle." Father Thomas Dubay, in his book, The Evidential Power of Beauty, says to us that if we could rediscover wonder, that is how we could find that everything is a miracle. He points out that from the time we're little children, we actually did wonder and marvel at the world, but that as we grow into adulthood, we actually lose our sense of wonder, he names 7 different ways we lose our sense of wonder. He says, first, we lose the experience of beauty. Secondly, that the adults in our life often don't spark wonder. They even discourage the questions that we ask as children, trying to go deeper. Thirdly, he says that sometimes education provides only facts and not wonder about the deeper truth of things. Fourth, we lose our connection to nature. And think about our world today, more and more in buildings, behind screens, but not actually encountering nature. Fifthly, that we lack instruction in moral beauty. If we are exposed to ethics and codes of living, they're often presented to us as lists of rules or things we shouldn't do, rather than being captivated by how beautiful it is to live a good life. Sixthly, he says that we get overstimulated. We're too busy. And so we get this psychological fatigue. Seventh, he talks about sin, or what we could call unloving choices. The more we make choices that are not in keeping with the call to love, the more we experience kind of the bankruptcy of our own interior lives. What do we do if we've lost that sense of wonder? There are 7 ways to start pursuing life to the full. First, rediscover beauty. Listen to beautiful, incredible music. Look at good art. Fill your life with beauty. Secondly, re-spark your sense of wonder. Ask great questions and really look for answers. Especially, thirdly, try to pursue wisdom, not just facts. Think about someone in your life who's truly wise and really listen to know the answers. Fourthly, explore nature. Go outside, go on a walk, enjoy something right in your own backyard. Fifthly, discover moral beauty. In the Catholic Church, we have this beautiful tradition of the lives of the saints. But even beyond the church, we can see people whose lives are beautiful. And we can seek true friendship, even if it's one other person who lives in a way that you look at and you say, I want to live like that. Reach out, get to know that person, and form true friendship. Sixthly, we need to seek simplicity and recollection instead of overstimulation. Build in times of quiet. Build in stillness. Think about how the way you fill up your day really does suit the way you want to live your life, and cut back. Cut out anything that's just useless and prioritize the things that really help you become the person you want to become. And I saved the best for last. The 7th, love. Let yourself be loved. Let yourself be loved by others. And if you're already walking in a relationship with God, be willing to go deeper. Commit yourself to a more intense life of prayer, a more intense life of friendship and service. The more we act lovingly, the more we choose to live for the good of other people, the more our life becomes life to the full. Listen in conversation with people. Send a note or a text to somebody. Look out for anyone around you who just needs help with something. As we love, we will experience life to the full. Jesus does not lie. And Jesus said in John 10:10, I came that you might have life and have it to the full. Fullness of life starts right where you are today. One choice to live and to love at a time. Let's choose to live life to the full.